Jeremy, so you worked as a High Court judge, and we look forward to hearing a bit more about some of the cases that you've been involved with. I know that before you got involved with your career in courts, you also had an interest in rugby, and you were quite a keen player for a while. And I know you've got some interesting stories related to that. So can you tell us a bit more about your time playing rugby for Oxford and the Harlequins, I think, after that?
Yes. Some of their worst years, the Harlequins, in fact. We were pretty bad. We got beaten a lot. They got beaten yesterday, I saw quite badly.
Did they? Okay.
Again. So I felt comfortable with that. So I played at Oxford for 3 years, and we had quite a good side, in fact. And one of the players who died just a few months ago actually became a Christian in the last year of his life. He was an international. He was a very famous rugby player. And I prayed for him for years. And he became a Christian in the last year of his life. Isn't that fantastic?
Oh, amazing.
His daughter told me all about it. So that was good. What can I say about rugby? It's a very different game today. I wouldn't last on the rugby field today. It's much more physical, and everybody's faster, fitter, stronger. And I'm not sure I would live with it.
And back in those days, I think you could even, playing for an Oxford side, play against national teams, couldn't you? So I think you guys played against South Africa, and
we beat the South Africans, the Springbok side, which, when you stop to think about that for a university side, is quite remarkable, isn't it? So that's going back a long way. It was an amateur game, of course, so it's very different from what it is today. People used to train in the evening and play at the weekend, and you did it for fun, basically, and you didn't get a cent out of it. In fact, you paid to play.
Wow.
Like any club that you join, you would pay a subscription to belong to the club, and you'd pay a match fee every time you played, and you'd pay for a jug of beer for the opposition.
Wow.
Yeah, so there you go.
And then I think you suffered a back injury, which sort of ended your time playing rugby.
Yeah.
And then you were a barrister for a while, and then you got called up to the service of being a High Court judge in 2001, I think. And you've been involved in quite a few high-profile cases that many of us may have heard about. So one of them being the stabbing of the politician Stephen Timms back in 2010, a Labour MP in London who was stabbed by an Islamic extremist, I think.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that case and what that was like presiding over that?
Yes. This chap, Stephen Timms, he was in a number of Labour cabinets. He had 13 different positions at different times. Never quite made it to the top. Was obviously a man who was greatly trusted, and indeed was a Christian. And he conducted one of his weekly surgeries, which all MPs do in their own constituency. And he was stabbed by an extremist, a young lady who believed in jihad. And she simply stabbed him because he was an infidel. So I had to preside over the attempted murder. Fortunately, it didn't succeed. There was really nothing much to the trial because she'd been seen. There were people there. People pulled her off. And he'd been wearing a thick jersey, which I think helped a bit. So although he was stabbed in the abdomen, he survived.
Wow.
But it was quite a high-profile trial. So there were lots of people in the public gallery and a lot of outcry. Indeed, I was cursed, and goodness knows what, by people shouting from the gallery when I came to sentence her. It was a very predictable sentence. But I was able to point out the difference between what a Christian's attitude would be towards people who hate them and what her attitude was to someone who she disagreed with about matters of faith and stabbed. And I got into a bit of trouble from the newspapers for saying such things about what Jesus said about loving your enemy and doing good to those who hate you and so on.
Wow.
Yeah. And then the newspapers don't like it when you do that sort of thing.
And then, Jeremy, later in the same year, I think you were involved in another high-profile case in the cricket spot-fixing scandal at Lord's, I think, in August of that year, which was a cricket match between England and Pakistan and some deliberate no balls. Can you tell us a bit more about that case and what that was like?
Well, at the time, I was running the circuit, the Southeast Circuit of criminal cases, and I saw that this cricket case was coming up, and I said, well, if anybody is going to be paid to watch cricket, I'll do it myself. So I decided I'd try it myself. It was the only case I actually chose specifically to do. And we had a jury, of course. And the allegation was, as was proved at the end of the day, that the Pakistani cricketers were bowling no balls at particular times, the fourth ball of the fourth over, the sixth ball of the seventh over, whatever it may be, because people were betting on this in the Far East. People bet on all sorts of things, so I expect some of you know who come from that background, but particularly in Singapore, Hong Kong, and China, people will bet about almost anything. And one of the things they would bet on was when a no ball would be bowled.
Mm.
And so these people being paid £10,000 or whatever it was to bowl a deliberate no ball at that particular point. And some of those players are still actually playing today. One has just come back. He was a youngster at the time, and I felt very sorry for him because he'd been influenced by the captain of the team to do what he did. But when he came to bowl a no ball, is cricket familiar to you? I don't know, but if you watch the pictures, the foot is meant to be behind the line, basically, and his foot is about that much over. I mean, it's so obvious that it's a deliberate thing. But anyway,
Wow.
So that was interesting.
Yeah. And were they found guilty in the
They
trial?
were found guilty.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
And you told me as well recently, this week, Jeremy, about another trial, I think a more recent one, of a man who kidnapped somebody, admitted to it in court, and then became a Christian. Is that right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit more about that case
Very,
as well?
very unusual, because this sort of thing doesn't happen very often. But this was a lad who'd helped in the kidnapping of someone, and he hadn't been involved in what happened after the kidnapping, which was the torture and death of the person concerned. But when he came to give evidence, he was a young lad, he was about 18, 19. When he came to give evidence, he got into the witness box and he said, I've sworn an oath on the New Testament to tell the truth. And he did, much to the surprise of all his fellow accused. So in telling the truth about what he'd done, of course, he let them all in for it too. But I was able to sentence him more leniently as a result. And it turned out he'd been brought up in a Christian home by a Christian mother. And the result of what had happened to him was that he either came back to faith or actually became a Christian.
Amazing. Yeah.
I was able to put him in touch with, there's some great organizations that work in prisons, you may know, Christian organizations. So he was put in touch with one of those and would attend their Bible studies and so on and so forth. And all good so far as I know.
Wow. Amazing. Amazing story. And obviously in lots of these cases, Jeremy, you've had a lot of experience weighing evidence and thinking about that sort of thing. How would you define evidence? What does evidence mean in your mind?
Right. Good question, because it comes up in the context of our gorilla, doesn't it? But evidence is simply what people say they have seen, heard, or experienced. So if you're a witness to a road accident, you might get called to give evidence in court, and you would simply say what it is that you've seen or heard or experienced. And that's true in every sphere of the law. Sometimes people don't actually turn up and give evidence. It's done on a witness statement or in an affidavit. But it's the same thing. That's what they're talking about. Now, how many people here put up their hands to say they'd seen a gorilla? How many people put up their hands and said, I saw a man dressed as a gorilla? Now, there's a point, you see. There's a question, isn't there? Not only about honesty, but about accuracy, about reliability. I assume it was a man from the tone of voice, by the way, but it might just have been a girl. Mine did, I don't know. Who was it?
It was a man.
It was.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
But there's a point, you see, about evidence. What you see, got to be reliable.
Thank you. And Jeremy, you're also a Christian, and I know that evidence has played a bit of a role in your story in coming to faith. Can you just tell us a bit more about what it was that persuaded you of Christian faith and of Jesus?
Yes, I didn't become a Christian in any dramatic sort of way. I was brought up in a Christian home. And then between the ages of about 14 and 16, I had to stop and think. You know how it is when you get to that age, you get a bit of teenage angst. What's all this about? And I could look at what was going on. I thought, life just seemed very dull. School, day in, day out, and then work, day in, day out. What's the point of all this? I then began to realize just how significant Christianity was. And I became convinced about the truth of the resurrection in particular. And what I also saw at the same time was a few older people, and I saw this at camps that I went to in the summer particularly, a few older people to whom the reality of their faith was so real it made a difference. I could see the authenticity of it. They lived it out, they believed it, and it made such a difference to their life, and it gave them a purpose. It gave them joy in what they were doing, joy in Jesus, and it worked. And so those two things, the truth and seeing how it worked, made me say, well, I've got to commit myself to it. So that's what I did.
And
Nothing dramatic. It took place over a period of a couple of years.
And since then, and throughout your career, Jeremy, what kind of difference has it made to the way you've gone about your life and your job and being a Christian? What sort of difference has that made?
Well, of course, in some ways, one does all the same things that everybody else does. You know, you go to work, you do the job. I was a judge. Plenty of judges aren't Christian. But you come from a different perspective, don't you? Because what you're seeking to do is to serve God in what you're doing. And rather oddly, about 2 weeks before I became a judge, I was reading a passage in the Bible that I didn't think I'd ever read before. So I'm talking now about, how old was I? 51 I was at the time. And I read this. It's about a king in the Old Testament. And he appoints judges. And he tells them this. He says, he appoints judges, sent them out, and said to them, "Consider what you do, for you judge not for man, but for the Lord. He's with you in giving judgment. Let the fear of the Lord be on you. Be careful what you do, for there is no injustice with the Lord our God, or partiality, or taking bribes." So there he's saying to his judges, be careful, do justice, be impartial, be fair, judge for the Lord, not for men. And 2 weeks later, I got a phone call from the Lord Chancellor saying, "Would you like to be a judge?" And this seemed to be spot on. So when I served as a judge, this was a verse I used to have written in front of me on the bench every time I sat, just to remind me what it was I was there about. And I think it's a good illustration, isn't it? Because what we're told to do, in everything we do, we work for the Lord and not for men. We work to please him.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. We're going to hear more from Jeremy later on in the service, but do feel free to now, Jeremy. You can come back up later when we're going to hear
Have
from you
more
again.
of this later?
You can have more of that later, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here again. Some time ago since I was last here, I think. I'm very old, but one of the television programs that I like is Would I Lie to You? Is that familiar? Oh, good. I'm glad it's not just me. Would I Lie to You? But in case you don't know, what it's all about is these people, they turn up panels and they have a competition, and each of them tells lies or the truth, and the other panel has to guess whether they're telling the lie or the truth. And it's David Mitchell and Lee Mack are the stars of the show, and it's extremely amusing. And they tell some highly improbable stories, some of which do turn out to be true. "What is truth?" said jesting Pilate, and would not stay for an answer. The quote by Francis Bacon, Lord Chancellor in 1577, picked up by Aldous Huxley later. What is truth? We had it read to us. That's what Pilate said. And he, of course, was a corrupt judge. And he's faced with a man who's accused of treason, who said he was a king, but from another place. And what's more, that person said that he came to testify, that is, to give evidence about the truth, and to do so with the authority of the place from which he came. And Pilate's stance was that of the cynic. What is truth? Can it be easily ascertained? Or does it really matter? Is it important compared with questions of power politics? Of course, the whole process of law is based on the premise that truth is, in fact, discoverable from what we call evidence, which, as Pilate recognized, would have led to the acquittal of the man in front of him. But he ignored the evidence. He brought in a conviction, whilst 3 times saying the man was innocent, and sought to limit his own responsibility for what he'd done. So he knew that evidence was important. He knew that truth was discoverable. He knew that in this case the prisoner was innocent, but he didn't let that get in the way of what he wanted to do in order to preserve himself and his own self-interest. It's the evidence that's important. I always used to stress this to juries. If you'd been in a jury and I was summing up a case to you at the end of a criminal trial, I would tell you, you don't investigate matters on the internet. You don't pay any attention to what you've read in the newspapers. You discard from your thinking everything else that you've heard outside this court. It's the evidence you've heard in this court that matters. And even the arguments of counsel, they're not evidence. The evidence is what you hear here, and you decide this case on the evidence and the evidence alone. Set aside all your preconceptions, assess the evidence for what you think is reliable, and come to a verdict based on it. And that's true for judges and juries alike. But it's also something that we should apply to all the big issues in life that we have to face, the problems we have to deal with. And in particular, to this question of Jesus' claims to testify to the truth. The big question that he actually asked his friends was not, would I lie to you? But who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? And of course, Pilate had to face that too, because he had to decide, who was this man? A man who described himself as a king from another world? A man who described himself as giving evidence of the truth, telling the truth, and a man who others wanted to put to death. Well, evidence, as I said earlier, takes two forms so far as courts are concerned. Basically, people come into a witness box and they simply say on oath what they'd seen, heard, or experienced. Sometimes you have it in writing in a witness statement or an affidavit. Again, what they saw, heard, or experienced. And there are rules about what's admissible and what isn't. But the basic question is, can it be relied on? Is it reliable? Is it accurate? And of course, the same thing is true not just for judges and juries, but for historians who write history books. The basis upon which they decide what they're going to write is the evidence, the records of what people said at or near the time of the events. And when they look at these records, these annals, these documents, whatever they may be, they have to give them such weight as they think they deserve as to how reliable they are. So they take into account the bias of the person who's writing it, so far as they know it. They take into account the desire for the person who's writing it to justify themselves, to exculpate themselves, what their reasons might be for telling the truth or lying about it, why they might be accurate or inaccurate in what they were saying, because they were drunk at the time or whatever it might be, and indeed the character of those concerned and the care with which the statement or record is written. And those will determine the weight which can be given to any piece of evidence. And your findings as a jury, as a historian, are based on all the evidence as you know it to be. What fits best the evidence that you have and which you accept as reliable and accurate? So what I would say to juries was this. I would say, members of the jury, you must examine the evidence and decide what you think is reliable and accurate. And then you may draw inferences. And when I say you may draw inferences, what I mean is that you can come to common sense conclusions on the basis of the evidence that you find to be reliable and accurate. And so the search is to look at all the evidence and find the most probative evidence and the most cogent explanation for what occurred in the light of it. Now, in my experience as a judge, and in civil and commercial cases, I would make all the decisions myself, no jury in cases of that kind. And I now sit as an arbitrator and do much the same thing. But once the issues are clarified and you see the wood from the trees, the evidence almost invariably points clearly to one conclusion rather than another. In court cases, you usually have one party, two parties, three parties perhaps, but each of them is putting forward a version of events, and you have to decide between them. But one conclusion is usually much more likely than the other. And that's the test that we apply in civil cases. It's called the balance of probabilities. simply means one conclusion is more likely to be the case than the other. And we make our decisions based on that. In a criminal case, it's a slightly higher burden of proof. You have to show beyond reasonable doubt, as it used to be said. You have to be sure, because it's much more serious if you're going to convict someone of a crime. But that's how the search for truth is conducted. And none of us doubt, do we, that there is truth to be discovered. Whether someone committed a murder or not, well, it's a yes or a no, isn't it? The person is dead or is not dead. The person's been killed by this person or he hasn't. There's no ambivalence about it at the end. There may be all sorts of reasons for it, all sorts of excuses, all sorts of mitigation, all sorts of things that come into it. But the basic question, there's a truth that has to be discovered. And actually, that's how you operate every day in real terms, isn't it? You go out into the street and you say to someone, can you direct me to the Cutty Sark? And they give you directions. And you decide, is that accurate or not? And if they cough and sputter and scratch their heads and look bewildered and then give you some instructions, you're less likely to believe them than if they speak to you with certainty and say, yes, I've just been there, it's around the corner. You reach a decision. You weigh the evidence, what the person is telling you. And similar decisions are made in every area of life. Isn't that so? Whole of education is based on what people tell you. And you have to take a view. Is that right? Most of us simply accept it, don't we? There's a lecturer up the front. He knows what he's talking about. I trust him. That's what you're doing. And you do it in every problem that you encounter in the world. What people tell you, you weigh it up in your own experience and you make a decision. And if it's hard, if it's difficult, you don't just throw your hands up in horror and say, it's all too difficult, I can't decide. The reality is this, isn't it? Everybody has a worldview, like it or not. It may be thought out, it may be muddled, it may be confused, it may be unconscious. But we have a world, when I say we have a worldview, what I mean is this. We, each of us, have a view as to what we think is important in life. What we believe about who we are, what we're about, what's valuable, what matters, what's right, what's wrong, and what the solution to things that are wrong actually is. And we think about the ultimate concerns of human beings, of life and death and suffering and good and evil, whether life has meaning or not, whether it's significant or not. And you know, whether it has meaning or not, I don't know anybody who doesn't live as if some things do matter. Now, where's the logic in that if life is completely chance and random? You see, everybody evaluates what they think is important and what they think is not important. There may be inconsistency about how they apply that, but they do have a worldview. And right now, of course, in the 21st century, the worldview is perhaps particularly muddled with professed agnosticism about the big questions in life, about God, about life after death, about ethics. But to say, as many people appear to, the truth can't be known, or I don't know, I have no view, or even I have no faith, is actually nonsense. Because like it or not, whether thought through or not, we all have some worldview of what we believe, whom we believe, and that affects the way we live and what we see as important. It may be gathered from your parents, it may be gathered from your peer group, it may be gathered from those who taught you, whatever it is, that's where you are. Say, I don't know, I'm an agnostic, and do nothing, is really to say, I don't think it matters very much. It doesn't really matter. Life is meaningless. But I venture to say that no one actually believes that life is really meaningless. And no one actually lives that out, do they? If everything is chance and accident, why do we live as if there is some importance, some significance in what we do? Because we revolt against that idea, we know instinctively it can't be so. Nobody can live that way as if nothing was more important than anything else. And we know that some things matter, that there is such a thing as truth. So I ask you, isn't it irrational for people not to think through what their worldview is, what the answers are to the big questions of life, and to come to a conclusion based on the most cogent evidence? So what does make most sense? What makes most sense of the universe in which we live? The order and rationality within it, which enables us to study science. Things work on a uniform basis, principles that we can follow. It's all here by chance. Why doesn't it work randomly? And why does it work in a manner that we can actually study? Why is humanity the way it is? Why do we have personality? Why do we have rational capacity? If all is chance, how can there be personality and rationality in us? How is it that humans can actually love each other and be capable of altruism and self-sacrifice? Where's the evolutionary selfish gene in that? And what about the ability of humans to be exceedingly wicked, malicious, and cruel without any real benefit to them in doing so? How is anything be seen as right or wrong? Or justice? I've never met anybody who says that they don't want justice if they've been hard done by. They believe in justice. Everybody believes in justice. How do you account for that? And we all have this need to search for truth and meaning in life, for our lives to be significant, to count. And why do we have religion? Different types of religion all over the world, but man instinctively has this sense of God and need for religion. And your worldview must take account, therefore, of all these elements and provide the most cogent explanation for them. It's irrational and illogical, I suggest, if it doesn't. And the Christian faith is not the opponent of rationality, because it does provide a logical, coherent, and cogent explanation for all of those features. And it does so by reference to Jesus, who referred to himself as giving evidence of ultimate truth because of who he was and where he came from. And so the question is, can he be relied on? Would he lie to you, if you like? So we need to come to a view about Jesus and the evidence for him. He asked his friends this question: who do you say that I am? And faith in Jesus is an entirely rational response to the evidence about him, if he is who he claimed to be. And trusting him, trusting what he says, is the only logical thing to do if he is who he says he is. He knows what he's talking about, and we'd better take notice. The evidence for Jesus, as you all doubtless know, is to be found essentially in the records that we have of his life, his teaching, his death, resurrection, and ascension in the New Testament. And I'm going to deal with this briefly because I brought a few books with you that you can you'll take home with you, if you like, and read about them. Here's a book, Can We Trust the Gospels? Short book, won't take you very long to read, but it deals with these things in much more detail than I can do now. Do feel free to take one. Just think about the New Testament records for a moment, though. You've heard this before, perhaps. Compare what we know about Jesus with what we know about any other figure of similar antiquity. Perhaps the most obvious person to take is Julius Caesar, who's about the same sort of time, a little bit earlier. What do we know about Julius Caesar? If you ever did Latin at school, you would have perhaps read his Gallic Wars. He fought the Gallic Wars. He came to Britain about 55, 54 BC. He went back, he crossed the Tiber, tried to make himself emperor in Rome, and was killed, assassinated by Brutus, Cassius, and others. Does anybody doubt that? No, not really. But how do you know? How do you know any of that? Well, if you want to look at material today, we've got about 9 or 10 manuscripts, the oldest of which was written 900 years after the events in question. But of course, it constitutes a copy of earlier information, earlier records, some of it written by Julius Caesar himself, Caesar's Gallic Wars, which some of us had to study in Latin years ago. And people generally accept that these have been faithfully reproduced in the later manuscripts and are confident enough to ascribe a degree of truth to it, but recognizing that what Caesar wrote about himself might be a little on the flattering side. What about Jesus? We have an enormous number of manuscripts. Manuscripts of the Gospels. We have one goes back, we have it in its complete form, to about AD 200 to 250. It's called Papyrus 45. It's in the Chester Beatty collection in Dublin. It's all 4 Gospels and Acts. And we have fragments of those in exactly the same form, going back much, much earlier, back to about 125, 130 AD. You can see one of them in the John Rylands Museum. And we have 25,000 manuscripts of varying age, but most far, far older than anything you've got about Julius Caesar. And the originals of those were, in the estimate of serious scholars, written in the lifetime of those who met Jesus. Written indeed by eyewitnesses, as we were hearing just earlier. Eyewitnesses, the record of what they saw, heard, and experienced. And so I want to suggest to you that we can be very confident that what we have now reflects what they wrote. And so when you approach the New Testament, you must approach it as the records of people who were there at the time and give that the weight which accords to that kind of evidence for a lawyer or historian. You see, what I think really the position is this. The problem about the Christian faith is not one of evidence at all. Because the evidence we have of Jesus' high moral teaching, nobody doubts he gave that, as you read it in the New Testament. We have evidence of his consistency of character, that he lived it out. No one could point to him and say, you don't live that way. But what caused his death and what causes people to jib now is what he said about himself, the claims that he made for himself, who he was, what he came to do, and the need for people to respond to him as the key to life itself. Which is why Jesus asked his friends, first, who do people say I am? And they said to him, well, some say you are revivification of a prophet, Elijah, Elisha, someone with good things to say. And many people today would quite like to come to that conclusion. A man who speaks high morality. But that won't do, will it? Not good enough. Because a man of high morality and integrity, whether a prophet from God or not, doesn't claim to be God. He doesn't claim equality with God, as Jesus did, if he's only a man. So there's a huge inconsistency there, isn't there? And the reply he gets from Peter, his closest friend, or one of his closest friends, is, you are God's anointed one, the Messiah, God's King, God's Son. And Jesus immediately goes on, as you recall, to say that he's going to die. And Peter can't accept that. How can God die? That can't be right. And one of the extraordinary things, therefore, is to see that what the New Testament shows is the reluctance of his own followers, people who ultimately came to faith in him, to accept who he really was. Because that wasn't quite what they expected to be like. What convinced them in the end was not the death that they hadn't expected, but his resurrection from the dead. That showed that he was who he said he was and established the reasons for his death. The classic skeptic, you know, is Thomas. He wouldn't believe what others told him. He wouldn't believe the person who told him about the gorilla who'd gone through the room. He would only believe when he saw the gorilla and touched the gorilla. He saw Jesus, and he was convinced when Jesus told him, reach out, shake my hand, see, See, excuse me, see the wounds. I speak from time to time about the evidence of the resurrection, and it may be that you were expecting me to speak on that this morning. You can come and hear me this afternoon, if you like, at Eltham College, when I am actually going to be addressing that. But the evidence about the resurrection is, to my mind, so compelling and so cogent, as have many other people who've investigated it, that it ought to persuade anybody that Jesus is who he says he is. But I'm going to finish with this because it just demonstrates the point that in the end, people do not necessarily follow the evidence. Do you remember the story that Jesus told about a rich man? He lives in a mansion and he's dressed in the most expensive and fashionable attire of the time. And he's described, indeed, as living in luxury. He obviously has a very large property because it doesn't front onto the street in the way that most houses would have done in those days. It has a portico, a front gate, a porch, as an entrance to his property, which is doubtless down a long road or alleyway or whatever. And in the shade of the portico, there's a beggar, Lazarus. He can be found there every day, and he's in a bad way. He'd gladly have eaten all the leftovers from any meal of the mansion owner, but the mansion owner gives him nothing. He'd see the man at his gate as he went in and out, but doesn't concern himself with them. While Lazarus is plagued with scavenging dogs, and they're unable to fend them off from his ravaged body. The sort of person we see sometimes quite regularly on the streets of London, living rough, but much worse, because there's no one to care for him. And life continues with the contrast in these two men's living conditions. And from what emerges later, we discover that the beggar has a right relationship with God, and the house owner doesn't. Because the house owner is caught up in his own living without any reference to God or what God requires of him. And the story told by Jesus has them in contrasting positions, contrasting conditions after death. And the beggar is described as sitting next to Abraham in paradise, whilst the mansion owner is in Hades and described as being in agony. And he asks Abraham to send Lazarus to bring him a drink. And Abraham's answer is simply this: can't happen. No way. Because of the way you've lived and the uncrossable chasm between the two locations where you now are. And for the first time, the mansion owner suddenly has a sign of concern for others. He asks Abraham to send Lazarus to warn his 5 brothers not to make the same mistake as he did and to leave God out of the picture. And Abraham says to him, why? What's the point of that? They've got everything they need. It's there in the Lord and the Prophets, the Jewish Bible. They tell you what God has done. They tell you what God requires of you. What more do you need? No, says the mansion owner. But if only someone would go back to them from the dead, then they'd stop and think again. Then they'd repent. Then they'd change their minds. Then they'd turn to God. And in the story, Abraham's response is to say, if they don't listen to Moses, if they don't listen to the prophets, they won't be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. And Jesus' story, you see, is aimed quite simply at those who will not consider the recorded evidence of what God has done. He says, even if a man were to return from death, some people would never change their mind, never change their worldview. However powerful the evidence is against their view and in favor of seeing things Jesus' way, as someone who rose from the dead to show that he was a king from another place. Some people will not examine the evidence for trusting Jesus. I can't persuade you, I wouldn't attempt to persuade you in a few minutes of the strength of the evidence in favor either of the resurrection of Jesus or of the Christian worldview, as explained by him. I can show you how it all stacks up. And I can say that it's all there to be investigated. And if you've never done that, then I invite you to investigate it for yourself. I've given you an outline, I've given you a place to go. There are many ways of doing it. There are courses such as Christianity Explored. There's a little red card in front of you which tells you about a course that's going to take place here. That's a thing to investigate for yourself. See what it is that appears in the Gospels. Find out if it's true. Or read the book. Do take one of those. Can we trust the Gospels? Take a Gospel itself. There's some over there as well. That's the place to start. Read the passages themselves. What the records of those who were there said. And do it with a Christian friend if you can. Find a Christian friend and say, I'd like to read that with you, and we can talk about it. We can discuss it on a one-to-one basis. And if you'd like to ask questions or know more, then I'd be very pleased to help you and point you in the right direction, as would Jono and any of the others here. But you can encounter the risen Jesus for yourself. His evidence of him in the New Testament. And I can't recommend strongly enough that that's what you should do. And if you've found him already, then share him with somebody else.